back to the Horror Academic. This month, I'm gonna go back to Wes Craven. I know in October we did the whole Nightmare on Elm Street extravaganza of every Nightmare film except for the remake, which I guess I'll have to cope with one day, but haven't yet. After rewatching New Nightmare, I couldn't help but think of Scream. So this episode, we're gonna talk Scream. I got the 4-pack here of the Scream series, but this time we're really just gonna talk about the first Scream. Why Scream? Why of all of Craven's films am I gonna go right to that one after doing Nightmare? I mean, we haven't even talked about Hills Have Eyes yet, Serpent and the Rainbow, People Under the Stairs. I mean, there's a lot of Craven to talk about. So why are we going to go to Scream? And I think really the importance, particularly coming off of New Nightmare, of postmodern horror and how that changed the game and how it opened things up. And in a lot of ways, what's really great about Scream is that it revitalized the genre at a time when it really needed it. It needed that kind of punch in the arm and that kind of resurgence to happen. Being a horror fan at that point in the 90s, there wasn't a lot out there. I mean, in mainstream horror, there was other horror definitely, but it was not especially after how prolific horror was in the 80s. The 90s felt kind of cookie cutter and bland and boring. And Scream comes along and says, let's change the rules. And you know why we're going to change the rules? Is because you already know the rules. Hint, hint. But the importance is that what we need to do is we need to make horror fun again. And we need to make it interesting. And we have to catch you off guard. So we're going to do that by completely acknowledging the fact that you've already seen all the horror movies that came out in the 70s and the 80s that made modern horror iconic. You know the genre. You know the subgenres. You know slashers. You know gore films. You know splatter. You know the actors. You know the directors. You know if we reference the films, you're going to stick with us and you're going to keep up. And that's what's great about Scream, is that it's so much of the film is a winking eye to those of us in the know, but at the same time, a completely palatable story if you don't understand all these little nuances. So, while I may not have seen Terror Train yet, when I'm watching Scream in a theater, I do understand the importance of Terror Train, because I know Jamie Lee Curtis is in it. And I know because this film is so heavily based in the lore that's created from films, particularly like Halloween and Nightmare on Elm Street, that I understand that this world is aware of the fact that we all, particularly when this is happening, have video store rental cards. We all go to Blockbusters or whatever mom and pop or Hollywood Video and spend our Friday nights with a stack of videos and some friends if we can. So knowing that I'm going into a world in the movie where the kids are, in some way at least, like me, in that they all know the jargon, they all know what's going to happen, they still fall for it, and you go along for the ride. So, let's start with some of the basics about Scream. Plot synopsis, particularly quick on this one. I'm assuming most people have seen this. It's modern enough, 1996. Scream is the story of Sidney Prescott and her friends, their high school and their town being terrorized in a series of killings. The killer, who we see as Ghostface, is using the motif of calling on a cell phone to ask questions about your favorite scary movie. Of course, it's a matter of who's the next victim. Is anyone safe in the school? Who could possibly be the killer? So Scream not only is a Wes Craven directed movie, but is the movie that kind of creates the career of Kevin Williamson, the writer. Kevin Williamson, after college, goes into acting. He gets gigs on Little Pictures, some soap operas, stuff like that, realizing that acting isn't quite what he wants, but he wants to be part of this. So he sits down at some point and starts writing a movie. And he writes it from the perspective of someone who knows movies. And what happens is when this script is finally done and he whittles it the way he wants and he gets it perfect, he sends it off, and there is this rare thing that happens in Hollywood where there's a bidding war. And it's between a couple of different companies that are people who are interested in the film, and the ones who win are Miramax. Without getting into current state of affairs in the world, and what the Weinsteins mean today, let's at least kind of put this in the perspective of what the Miramax, not necessarily the Weinsteins, but Miramax meant to movies in the 90s. Miramax was the place that brought all the cutting edge, right? Miramax was independent filmmakers. It was stuff that was really kind of out in left field. It was films that were taking risks and chances. It was not Columbia Pictures, Universal Pictures, all of the mainstream, the Paramounts. This was a company known for setting the trends of what was going to come. So Miramax are the people who brought us Kevin Smith. Miramax are the people who brought us some Tarantino films. Some of the great stuff that came out of the 90s comes from Miramax. So this is important, is that where New Line was the cutting edge, the stuff out in left field that was far from the mainstream in the 80s, that picked up Nightmare on Elm Street when nobody else was interested, Miramax is the company that's ready to take the risk with something like Scream. In a time when horror is not popular, they're willing to take the risk on a new writer with a new take on horror. So Miramax wins it, they reach out, and they get Wes Craven involved. They give him the script, he's all for it, and he ends up teaming with Kevin Williamson to make the film. So it's the pairing of somebody brand new, who's a film fan, who's writing a movie that is very much filled with a world of fans of films, and someone who is a known master of horror, pairing with him to make that film happen. So this leads to some bizarre self-referential moments that are not intentional. So remember that Wes Craven did not write the script to Scream. So when Wes Craven is directing a scene where they're referencing a Wes Craven movie, it gets a little weird. And I'm sure it was for him. There's a moment where early on, the first phone call is to Drew Barrymore's character, and the killer is talking to her about what's her favorite scary movie, and they talk about Nightmare on Elm Street, and there's a line where it's like, oh, the first one was awesome, but the sequels, they sucked. And Wes Craven in the extras is even saying, I didn't write that line. Seriously, I did not write that line, because it's just funny because he had some things to say about some of the sequels that are being referenced here. How they kind of deal with this is they invent the director Wes Carpenter, so that name gets thrown around a couple times. But everybody in this film has seen the movie Halloween. We can assume that they've all seen Friday the 13th. It seems like Texas Chainsaw is very much up for grabs. Perhaps movies like The Evil Dead. Whatever were the high renters in the horror section of Blockbuster and Hollywood and all those chains, that's where these guys go. So this is not necessarily mainstream horror, but horror that was popular with teenagers going to video stores. It's a lot of the films that led to sequels, and that's what we found in video stores a lot. You don't hear references to a lot of, international films. It's very American-centric in ways. It's very slasher heavy, because that's also, predominantly a teen-viewed subgenre of horror. You have Craven, someone who's made the movies that are totally referenced in this movie, and Williamson kind of like at one point going, holy crap, I didn't expect him to be the one to make this. This was my dream, but now that he's making it, this is kind of funny to me. So that's a cool little thing that just kind of happens because of this movie. There's so many movies Wes Craven made. Just to name a few, obviously we've already talked Nightmare on Elm Street. I think Hills Have Eyes we've mentioned. Last House on the Left. So many things that Wes Craven has made before here. He's prolific. Not every film of his would we say is on mark, but he has definitely been a huge influencer before coming to Scream. So Williamson's career, there's a few movies after this. He did Scream 2 and 4, The Faculty, which is a good sci-fi high school alien invasion movie. Fun one. I Know What You Did Last Summer. So, he kind of has this kind of plethora of horror films or genre films that come out after Scream. But, of course, he ends up being more of a TV writer. After this, a producer who read the script for Scream decides to bring him on board to write Dawson's Creek, which becomes huge for his career and leads more in a television route. I believe he was the head writer on Vampire Diaries, I read, and also the Scream TV series. So, but yeah, let's go back to some of the actors that we see in this film. Because especially they're so young, so many of them kind of blow up, their careers become huge, or even if their careers don't become huge, at the time they got super famous, and to the point where it's like you saw their faces everywhere. First up is Neve Campbell, who is Sidney Prescott. Also, right around this time does The Craft, which is huge. She also is from a TV world, like Party of Five, I think was her show. A lot of like thriller type films, like Wild Things. But she's one of those people who was just kind of all over the place in the 90s. Courtney Cox, who's the reporter, Gail Weathers. Lots of TV stuff. Like, of course, she was huge with Friends, and I believe like Cougar Town, stuff like that. But a little more recently. But flipping through her IMDb to see if there's any other genre films of note, I didn't realize one of her early films was Master of the Universe. She was the kid, or I guess she was a teenager in that, who meets He-Man when he comes to present day. So that's fun. I just love that movie. Next up, David Arquette. So David Arquette was in a ton of movies back then. We look for his genre stuff. You got like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the movie, Eight-Legged Freaks. A little more serious, he was in Ravenous, the cannibal film. He was also in Riding the Bullet, the Stephen King movie. But what was interesting is early 2000s, he directed a feature called The Tripper, which is a serial killer. I kind of remember that it takes place at like a Lollapalooza kind of thing, and the killer is obsessed with and looks like Ronald Reagan. Like, I think he wears a Ronald Reagan kind of disguise. Skeet Ulrich, another person in a million things at the time, kind of saw his face everywhere, of course, like Neve Campbell from The Craft. As far as other genre films, I saw on the list Escape Room, and it seems like he's also in the series Riverdale. So, a ton of stuff, mostly TV, like CSI type thing. Rose McGowan's in this movie very, very early in her career, kind of pre-Charmed. So she, of course, also movies like Phantoms, which kind of was, had, at least in the poster art style, was a little bit Scream-like. But she also, of course, in Jawbreaker and Grindhouse. Both stories of Grindhouse, so cool seeing her here very young. Matthew Lillard, talking about people who were in tons of stuff at that time. I love Hackers, but that's not really genre. So, what else did Lillard do that is genre? How about Serial Mom? A little John Waters in there. Aside from Scooby-Doo, he was also in 13 Ghosts remake, which was a very cool, fun little film. You also have Jamie Kennedy, a ton of stuff all over the place in the 90s. Son of the Mask, I guess, would be his other genre outing. Can't forget, though, the first scenes entry with Drew Barrymore. So Drew Barrymore, this was almost like coming back to genre for her. Of course, her career starts with movies like E.T. and Firestarter. Let's see what after that. Cat's Eye, another Stephen King story. When she becomes a teen, she gets more into these kind of seductive thriller type things with Poison Ivy. Nowadays, probably the most recent thing I've seen her in is Santa Clarita Diet, which is a fun kind of gory suburb fest. But here she's almost kind of like the elder statesman, like here's somebody who started as a child star coming back in a movie, decades later. There's almost a nod to her being the Janet Leigh of this film, where in Psycho, Janet Leigh is kind of, you're led to believe is the star of the film, but of course, spoiler for a movie made in 1960, she dies in the first reel. So, and spoiler for a movie that we're talking about today, Drew Barrymore does not get much further in this film. So, in a similar setup, and a nod very much so to Psycho, you have the known starlet who dies early in the film, where we have all these new up-and-comers who take up afterwards. So it's kind of a bit of a passing of the torch kind of thing. So it's interesting. She's not much older, I believe, than the rest of the actors, but she's given this this position because of her status. So the psycho thing is one of so many references throughout this film. This is like this pre-Easter egg age of filmmaking, where you could say in this film almost everything is an Easter egg, because there are so many references to everything and anything. You have the characters literally discussing Jamie Lee Curtis and her career. You have characters talking about The Town That Dreaded Sundown. There's references to Norman Bates. There's references to Texas Chainsaw. There's references to, like I said, kind of the canon of every video store of horror that is 70s and 80s influential horror. So, even to the point that there is a joke about Freddy Krueger in the film, where in the high school the janitor is named Freddy, wears a red and green sweater and a dirty brown hat. So there you go. So that's kind of the tongue-in-cheekness of this film, and that's where we see also this kind of freshness. Instead of playing down to the audience the idea that we know you watch horror movies, now it's more like, we know you watch horror movies, right? So it's not like, forget everything you know because this movie's going to be different. No. Remember everything you know, because this movie knows that too. And that's really kind of groundbreaking and changing and energetic and interesting. In the same idea of referencing other movies, there's also nods to the fact that, so the character of Sydney is dealing with the fact that she's a year after the death of her mother. A brutal murder, and that's a very huge court trial, so she's been dogged by the media for a year now. It's kind of resurgence because now there's another killing in the neighborhood. One of the kind of like extras is a cameo by Linda Blair, who famously, because of The Exorcist, was fairly dogged by everyone and anyone about her role in a film when she was so young that was so graphic and violent and everything sacrilegious about it. There's a shared moment between Linda Blair, the actress playing this reporter, and the character Sidney Prescott as someone who is very similarly being harassed by the media. And in one of the interviews with Wes Craven that's on the disc, he discusses the fact that although these characters are very familiar with the stereotypes and the tropes and the scenarios that are common to these films, they still fall into these traps because you don't know what you would do until you're in the middle of it, right? You don't know if you're the person that's going to run, or if you're the person who's going to panic, or if you're the person who's going to fight back. So they play with this as well, of by making you, the audience, so aware of the fact that these kids all know these movies inside and out. Once they're in those situations, they all cope differently. And that's kind of this kind of analysis of what is it about these, as Craven likes to say, scary movies. He does not like to use the word slasher. He doesn't particularly use the word horror, although I suspect that's because it's that period in the 90s where horror was a bad word. Let's talk about that for a second. So in the 90s, horror became very unfashionable, but because of that, it was kind of a no-no to even say that your film was a horror film. You can read in Fangoria. There's actually, in one of the new resurgence of Fangoria, there's an article discussing how hard it was to report on horror in the 90s when the big budget films, like Silence of the Lambs, would not use the word horror. It was a thriller. It was a crime thriller. It was a serial killer story. It was not a horror movie. The same could be said for Interview with a Vampire. It was not allowed to use the word horror in its campaign. Especially because coming from a production house like Miramax, that is not particularly famous for horror like New Line would have been, they're still staying away from that term, horror movie. They say scary movie. Another person that kind of is of interest in this that shows up is the principal is played by Henry Winkler, the Fonz. But the thing is that he's part of a series of red herrings throughout the film where deep down we know that they're not the prime suspect, but the film tries to give us at least a few moments of making us wonder if he should be a suspect. I guess maybe also, particularly watching the film now, in 2020s, the idea of a principal touching a student's face to console her is a no-no. But you even see the sheriff kind of like, when he does that. Not appropriate. The fact that when two of the boys in the school run rampant and are wearing the same costume that the killer would use, the Ghostface costume, terrorizing people in the hallways, he's rather vicious in the way he speaks to them, and the film highlights this with his thrusting back and forth of a pair of scissors, very large pair of scissors that he cuts the mask up with, and the sound effects of the shing, shing, so he's very, from someone who seems to have a very kind of mellow demeanor, all of a sudden with these two guys he gets very hostile. So that's like, oh, maybe he could, on the fly, he could just kind of like flip like that. So it puts that out there. There's even moments they want to make you think that possibly Arquette's character, Dewey, that he, even though he's one of the cops who's helping the girls stay safe, that maybe he's the killer. Like, there's quite a few of these setups. Are you sure about this person? Are you sure about that person? And of course the main kind of thrust of it is the kind of pushing guilt on Sidney's father, particularly because of the anniversary of his wife's death. And could this be something setting him off? So we have all these setups of, I guess, the more traditional villain, the who really could be expected in old school horror movies to be the killer. Adult men, I guess, is more the target. And there's even a conversation where they joke about the fact, like, well, it could have been a girl, she could have been a killer. Of course, women aren't strong enough to do that type. Yeah. So that conversation even comes into play, which of course leads to another thing about this film that is very different, which is, this is total spoiler, so like seriously, if you haven't seen this movie, you may not want to know this, the fact that it's not just one killer. That's not normal. And that's another way where it's like, whoa, haven't seen that before. That's neat. Okay, there's definitely horror films in the past. I mean, like, that they even reference films where someone has, like, someone who helps them with their murders, but two people who definitely are the ones responsible for the murders is a little different. So that's also another thing that was like, oh, that's kind of different at the time. Much like the importance of dialogue in any Wes Craven film, because I do think that's a very important factor in Wes Craven's films, is the kind of a relatable banter conversation style. The dialogue in this movie feels fairly realistic and feels a lot more believable from teenagers at the time. I mean, there's obviously parties and keggers and jocks and, all that kind of stuff. But, you have like kind of the nerdy movie guy who's the one who works at their equivalent of Blockbuster, who's been working there so many times he's gotten fired 3 times, whatever it was. But this leads to some really interesting conversations. Like, there's a moment when Stu, Matthew Lillard's character, and Jamie Kennedy's character, Randy, are in the video store while he's working and start going through the possible suspects. There's a way in this conversation that first gives the general feel that the movie has already had, where we have movie referential banter back and forth, but then it kind of switches to more of a true crime style of speaking about the matter, and at the same time, we have the added element when the third character, Billy, Skeet Ulrich's character, comes into the scene as well, and you have Randy trapped between the two guys who are like best friends, and how the tone shifts. And this is probably one of the first moments where you can kind of understand what the dynamic might be at play here. It's a very clever scene. I've always particularly liked the way that also the music cues change within that scene. Something's happening here, pay attention. But without the girls around at all in that scene, the guys are very different with each other. So that's interesting. Particularly appreciate that scene. So, 1996 for Scream, right? Trying to place this with, it's probably too close for Carol Clover's Men, Women, and Chainsaws. I don't believe the term final girl is specifically used, but there is the concept of the survivor girl, which is the other term, of course, that Clover uses to describe the protagonist female of the films. But there's also kind of the expectedness of what we see in a female character in a horror film that is told first by Sydney's perspective of, oh, you know, I hate those kind of dumb blondes in those movies who are, you know, running up the stairs instead of out the door when they know the killer's there. And of course she's forced into a situation of doing just that. I believe it's Rose McGowan's character of Tatum who references this kind of ridiculous kind of TNA expectancy of the 70s and 80s horror films that they're referencing. So there's also that acknowledgement. There's the discussion of, you know, don't lose your virginity, you're not going to be the girl who survives. And of course they play with that motif in a very interesting way of turning that around. Which leads us, of course, to Randy's character and the idea of the rules. So the rules of a horror film are, of course, what first one I believe is don't have sex. Don't ever have sex because you're going to die. The second is, you know, don't drink or do drugs because that's just an extension of the first sin, so you're just in as bad shape as if you were having sex. Of course, this is all the kind of morality syndrome things that we talk about in analysis of slasher films. And of course, his third rule is don't ever say, I'll be right back. So of course, Matthew Lillard says, I'll be right back. So that comes up quite a bit. So those are the rules, and this is the film that kind of flatly introduces those as the rules. But of course, like I say, we have other rules introduced to us because of what is expected of what we would consider the final girl or the survivor girl of the film. Does this film count as a final girl film? I have definitely seen Sydney on many lists of final girls. The fact that Gail also survives, can you have a final girl if she's not the only one that survives? You know. And Randy survives too. Was he final boy? Does he do as much to perpetuate the fact that he survives? Aside from that, I mean, I think Sydney's definitely has a lot of the characteristics we look for in a final girl character. She's the one who's aware, she's the one who's smart, she's the one in danger, who is perhaps kind of confronted with these things whilst her friends are not paying attention to them, although in this case they know they're happening because everyone knows about the killing. So she is more proactive in many ways, and she's also, especially since she has been attacked already without being killed, she is forced to try and peg the killer. Killers in this case. So I think there's a good argument for Sydney to be a final girl, even though she's not the sole survivor of the film. I mean, I particularly love once we get to the end and we do finally get the reveal that the two guys together are the killer. There's some really great back and forth between them and Sydney with them of phrases obviously taken from all the movies we've talked about, right? I mean, there's references to, you know, we all go a little mad sometimes, a little Norman Bates in there. There's plenty of moments where you can see the writer and the director coming through in these killers with phrases such as, you know, horror movies don't make psycho killers, they just make psycho killers more creative. You know, this is definitely stuff that was discussed at the time. Do we blame horror movies for violence and, you know, all of that kind of bullshit? But, so there's a lot to kind of unpack in fandom within this film. Is it kind of pointing a finger at fandom, or is it saying fandom is actually what leads to them knowing how to survive? So that's an interesting kind of play on that as well. I think it's important to say that this film could not really happen before this period of the mid-90s because of the cell phone influence. You can't have made a movie where the killer can be calling from anywhere. Also, wireless phones, which of course is like a piece of the past now, without the ability of the girl who's being called by the killers to walk around and to see what they want her to see, or to see if she can see them at all. That if she had a static line like a 70s scenario of the babysitter alone in the house with a corded phone, that's too limiting of the spectrum. So the ability to have the cordless phone, also the fact that the cordless phone many times is not hung up, becomes vital to kind of the technology and the limitations of the world of this film. But the cell phone, of course, makes all of this possible. The fact that we have the nod right away that because cells aren't normal yet, what are you doing with a cell phone is almost like saying, what are you doing with a gun? You know, like, that's just as weird for you to have, you know, as a high school kid. There's even a moment where Sydney, in a kind of like a rush of trying to figure out what to do to escape, she tries calling 911 using her computer, which is funny because they react, but she doesn't, because then she sees, of course, Billy, her boyfriend, and that becomes the suspectness. All of this to say, Sydney uses all this tech in a way to, or her knowledge of what's going on, not so much as entrenched in the movies as the rest of her friends, but her ability to kind of assess situations. Even though she doesn't quite expect what the reality is, she can respond to it, and she can kind of overcome it. So, strong character. Neve Campbell does a great job with this. And of course, Wes Craven is fairly famous for his ability to have a strong female character, which is great. So what do we want to say are the reasons why a movie from '96, which is much later than most of the films we've discussed so far, can be considered a modern classic? First off, it is, like we said, it's that breath of fresh air to the genre. It is the revitalization of the horror genre and putting it in more popular fare. So now it is a very mainstream hit. So that is at a time when horror really needed that shot in the arm to get itself back up again. So that's very important about this. This revitalization of the genre with something fresh and new and different. Important. It is putting Wes Craven back in the forefront, because here's someone who had quite a important horror career and is maybe at a low, so puts him back in fame. It jumpstarts the career of Kevin Williamson, who will go on to do other horror films and genre films and TV series within the genre, so that's an important kind of kickstart as well. The dawn of the postmodern horror film. I mean, we did talk about how, when we discussed New Nightmare, back a couple episodes ago with Mel of the Brook Reading podcast, that you couldn't have Scream without New Nightmare happening first, because it's a film that lives in a world where these films are really movies. And Scream is definitely falling into that line of thought of, here's a world where the kids are very aware of horror films, they've seen horror films, they know horror films, they know the rules of horror films, they know the people who made them, they know the actors and actresses that are in them. So they're very informed by what they know about the world that we just happen to also know. So it's this postmodern reality of going forward and saying, they are in the same world you are. And not in this kind of vague way of, they're in middle America, you know, that kind of crap. No, they honestly understand that you've seen the same movies they have. This kind of meta world that they live in. So, while New Nightmare made that possible, Scream is what kind of made that the norm. So that's important. Of course it got overused, just like any other, new great thing that happens in any genre. It becomes cookie-cuttered and overdone and blah, 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 but you can't discount the movie that did it first, or did it best, or did it in a way that got to the most people because of what happened after it. Not its fault. So I don't blame Scream for all the movies that came after that tried to be Scream. Right? So, important, don't throw that out and forget that Scream is what did it the best. And maybe as a last thing I would say, it's something rare in horror where it kind of created a new iconic killer, or at least a new iconic image of a killer. Ghostface over here, is just as known now as, I would say, maybe not as high as, but maybe the fifth rung after Freddy, Jason, Michael Myers, Pinhead, all of those guys, Leatherface. Ghostface is part of that pantheon now. So that's important. It starts here. The irony being that it's based on the idea of it being a generic Halloween costume, that it becomes a standard Halloween costume. So while I have little Ghostface out here, I'll talk a little bit about my collectibles. We've got our Funko Pop, right? no Ghostface. And of course, very early on in the Movie Maniacs McFarlane series, we have an excellent Ghostface figure, who, as you can see, not only has his hunting knife, but his just as dangerous cell phone. So, this is like, top of the line. If you're gonna get some Scream collectibles, I highly recommend. Let's talk about my Scream collection. Of course, I did have this on VHS tape when it came out. Don't have it anymore. I did pick up the Laserdisc when it came out, or maybe soon after it came out. Okay, so there is the audio commentary. Yeah, that's the only extra I know of on this, is the audio commentary, just with Wes Craven. And of course, the special edition is the fact that it's the AC3 Dolby Digital stereo soundtrack, which is pretty much what Laserdisc was kind of known for, was those higher end audio stylings. So, good to have. I don't believe there's any, this is like the exclusive widescreen director's cut. I think this is the edition, as far as Laserdisc goes. Little signature on there, David Arquette, met him a while back. Which leads also to the other thing we got signed by David Arquette is the DVD, the widescreen special edition, which has complete audio commentary by Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson now. So this is a different commentary track with a theatrical trailer. And hey, Chapter Search is listed as an extra or special feature. Right. I kind of feel like it may have also had the kind of made-on-set featurette. Don't fear, if it's not on here, this is of course the Dimension, which was the horror side of Miramax, and I believe this is one of the first, this is the franchise that kind of led to there being a horror side of Miramax. The same here, this is the Dimension release, yeah. As I said before, the Blu-ray is the 4-disc collector's set, the complete collection, which will of course be no longer true. But Scream 2, 3, 4, now listed instead of as Dimension, we're now listed as Miramax and the Weinstein Company, which of course does not exist anymore. I will say, this is a little bit more special edition, but I had a feeling these were the extras from the DVD, to be totally honest. But I will say the picture is pretty amazing, so it's worth an upgrade in that respect. The extras, there's not a lot. Like I said, there's a behind-the-scenes featurette that's it's practically the trailer with a bunch of behind-the-scenes footage and the very staged question moments with the primary cast and important crew members. But it's very press junket-y. The supplements to that is there's 3 minutes of behind the scenes of the making of, where it's just footage kind of shot music video style, and the same is a separate 3-minute piece that is just working on the segment that was shot with Drew Barrymore, which was shot aside from the rest of the picture, since she does not have any other cast members that are part of the other story, so her part was shot very separately from the rest of the film. And I believe she was not around for the rest of the film, so her part is very separate. The Q&A that's listed on the Blu-ray is the extended answers from the featurette, which is got some interesting stuff. Of course, it's like, what's your favorite scary movie? What is the fascination people have with scary movies, which leads to the clips from both Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson that we see later. But we have them talking about the idea of the roller coaster. Horror is a roller coaster because it's a safe place to be scared. It's a safe place to get that adrenaline rush. Of course, this theory, George Romero's used this before, Tobe Hooper's used this before. It's a pretty common answer. Williamson talks about the fact that there's nothing like the experience of going into a darkened theater and to know that you can quite safely have, scare the wits out of you. And that's that cathartic feeling. So both of them kind of get a moment to discuss that. I will say, as a collection, I was sorely missing the opportunity for a retrospective piece. I would have loved for there to be like a half-hour interview with the cast and crew talking about Scream now, which would have been fascinating because the ability for them to look back and see all the things that Scream did to the horror genre and how it changed the horror genre. Not everybody was a fan of Scream when it came out because of the fact that it was so different. I think there were more people who either loved or appreciated than those who just straight up hated it. So it would be interesting to see a retro piece about it now. Aside from that, I can say so far that it's worth the Blu-ray upgrade for that. Who knows? I don't know if the 4K edition has that kind of retrospective part. Something to look into. But I'm definitely going to recommend this set for at least movie 1 so far. As you could probably guess, as the pattern that we have seen in my past episodes where I've done Planet of the Apes and Nightmare on Elm Street box sets, next episode I will break down 2, 3, and 4. Why will I take one episode to do 2, 3, and 4? Because nothing can compare to the original. Same reason with the other films. So I really enjoyed the ability to go back and rewatch Scream and think about it today, kind of where it kind of fits in the world. I will say that this is a movie in 1996 when it came out. I went to see with one of my close friends at the time. We sat in the theater and I was in awe of the film. And at the end, it was the first experience that I had in the theater of, I wish I had thought of that. I wish I had made that movie. I wish I had written that movie, because it was just, it spoke to me in a way that it felt like something authentic and real that I could have also wanted to create. So, the important moment for me. So, that's Scream 1. Quick show note, I just wanted to mention to you guys, you may have noticed that in the beginning of this episode and after the credits, you will not hear the Project Entertainment bug. There's also no promo from a Project Entertainment podcast in this episode. That's because I've asked to leave the group. I am nothing against Project Entertainment Network. I still, really appreciate them, and they were nothing but nice to me, and I still listen to those podcasts. I will say that, I'm not a podcast. I'm a YouTube show. So, looking for other ways or other groups to be part of, to better promote and be part of a YouTuber community. HorrorTube is a huge hashtag out there. There's a lot of HorrorTubers. It's just a matter of me trying to better find a home for the show that fits the community that it should be part of. So, we'll see what happens with that. I'll let you guys know. But thanks again, and I'll see you next time on The Horror Academic.